If there were a specter that has been haunting this world for over a century, one that, far from fading away with the changing times, is now sitting beside your cramped desk, gazing coldly at your hollowed-out soul through the blue glow of your computer screen, how would you feel? Welcome back to The Void. Today, we won't be serving up insincere workplace platitudes, nor will we be perpetuating those capitalist myths about hard work leading to success. Instead, we're going to confront the deepest-seated depression, exhaustion, and nihilism of our age. Imagine this utterly absurd yet painfully real scenario. At 7 in the morning, you're jolted awake by the shrill ring of your mobile alarm, forcing yourself into a rush-hour tube carriage as packed as a tin of sardines. During your tedious commute, you frantically swipe through your screen, consuming those meticulously edited, garish short videos, attempting to fill the ever-expanding void within you with this high-frequency dopamine rush. You believe you possess free will, don't you? After all, you are free to choose which takeaway to order for lunch today, and to pick your preferred brand from hundreds of similar products. But in what the South Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls the society of fatigue, in this hyperreal hyperreality illusion perfectly wrapped in algorithms and consumerism, you are nothing more than an insignificant node in the system's operation, a performance subject engaged in constant self-exploitation. You think you are in control of your life, but in reality, it is the capitalist logic behind life that is perfectly controlling you. When you feel exhausted, when you feel your vitality being mercilessly crushed by some immense unnameable force, have you ever tried to identify the root cause of this absurd predicament? This inevitably leads us to turn our gaze to the 19th century, to that German man with the thick beard. In today's world, it is fair to say that there are very few people who have not heard the name Marx. He is like a colossal, omnipresent cultural symbol, hovering above the common knowledge of modern humanity. But here's the question. When you hear the name Marx, what is the first thing that springs to mind? A cruel and ironic reality is that our understanding of him likely remains confined to secondary school or university textbooks on political economy. Try to recall your school days. On those drowsy afternoons, during those years spent cramming for exams, the world's most subversive revolutionary theory was safely compressed into a few dry, hollow phrases. Our minds were limited to storing such dry, fragmented phrases as historical materialism, the productive forces determine the relations of production, and the economic base determines the superstructure. Is this not the most ingenious manifestation of the logic of domination? To transform a radical thinker who sought to destroy the old world into a tedious topic for a compulsory exam, to drain the life and substance from him with rigid dogma, so that you grow weary of him before you have truly understood him. The most effective way for a system to eliminate dissent is to mold it into a lifeless, perfect statue. We are told he was a dry economist, yet this overlooks the most fatal and fundamental point. We actually know very little about Marx's true philosophical thought. Our eyes have been blinded by those grand economic formulas and cold clinical definitions, causing us to forget that he was, first and foremost, a soul who faced the sufferings of his era and let out a desperate and furious roar. Marx was a renowned 19th-century German philosopher and one of the founders of Marxist philosophy. Why are we so determined to delve into his philosophy? Because without understanding the philosophical underpinnings of his thought, one cannot truly grasp the theories with which he sought to deconstruct the world. His later, vast and profound ideas on political economy, as well as his sociological thought, were in fact entirely born of his philosophical ideas. Philosophy was the true scalpel with which he dissected this capitalist world. Without a philosophical awakening, without the interrogation of ultimate existential questions such as, what is the essence of humanity, and why does humanity become alienated? There would have been no subsequent profound exposure of capital's ruthless exploitation. Precisely for this reason, in this specially produced video, this extended edition of Marx's philosophical thought running over an hour, I do not intend to regurgitate any dry textbook content. What I intend to do is conduct a deep spiritual excavation. In this series, I will lead you on a single, uninterrupted descent into the abyss, taking you to explore the very depths of Marx's philosophical thought. We shall dissect his ideas as if dismantling a precision-engineered time bomb, examining exactly how they took shape step by step amidst the quagmire of history, and what truly earth-shattering truths they revealed to the world. To ensure you do not get lost in this deep sea of ideas, I have carefully divided this series into 8 parts. This is by no means a haphazard collection, but a rigorous logical chain that unfolds in a step-by-step progression. Each part serves as a step on the ladder leading to ultimate enlightenment. Therefore, I strongly advise you to set aside the habit of fragmented fast food-style browsing and instead settle down to watch the episodes in sequence. This is not merely a matter of reverence for a great mind, but a thorough reconstruction of your own entrenched perceptions. However, before we delve fully into Marx's thunderous ideas, we must not plunge headlong into a labyrinth of abstract concepts. Philosophers are flesh and blood, and the sparks of thought always ignite through the friction of reality. We must first return to the man himself and briefly outline Marx's life. For to truly comprehend a man's ideas, understanding his life is of the utmost importance. The reason Marx developed a system of thought that sought to shatter the old world was by no means the result of idle musings within an ivory tower. It is inextricably linked to the historical context of his era and the tumultuous course of his life. He was once a rebellious youth, a student who spent his youth in taverns, an exile expelled by the governments of several nations, and a tragic father who watched his child die in abject poverty. It was precisely these trials and tribulations, unbearable to most, that forged the extraordinary sharpness of his intellect. So, what sort of family and what currents of the age gave birth to the specter poised to unleash a global storm? And how did the wheels of fate begin to turn when a young man from a wealthy middle-class background plunged headlong into the vast shadow of Hegel's absolute spirit? Take a deep breath. Unplug the cable, sever your connection to hyperreality. Our journey into the abyss is now officially underway. The rebellious youth of Trier and the fervor of Berlin. Imagine this scene, so full of contrasts. We often subconsciously assume that a revolutionary leader destined to shatter the old world and champion the cause of the proletariat must have emerged from some kind of abyss of extreme hunger and cold. We are drawn to the heroic narrative of someone rising from the depths, bearing the scars of hardship and facing death head-on. Yet in the absurd theater of reality, history's script never plays by the rules. Karl Marx, the specter who would later strike fear into the hearts of capitalists across Europe, and indeed the globe, did not in fact have a tragic childhood. On the contrary, he was carefully nurtured by the very class he would later set out to bury with his own hands. Let us rewind to early 19th century Europe. In 1818, Marx was born in the German city of Trier. He came into the world into a relatively affluent middle-class family. His father was not only a respected Jewish lawyer, but also an intellectual with exceptionally progressive ideas. This father was deeply enamored with the ideas of Western Enlightenment thinkers, such as Voltaire and Rousseau, and would often engage in lofty discourse on these matters in the family drawing room. One can easily picture the scene by a warm fireplace, with flickering candlelight casting its glow upon the spines of fine-bound volumes. The young Marx sat nearby, breathing in an atmosphere steeped in bourgeois values. From an early age, Marx was deeply influenced by this liberalism and the Enlightenment. This was an extremely dangerous ideological implantation. In an era when the logic of capitalism had not yet fully revealed its ugly face, Enlightenment thought gave this young boy the illusion that, by relying on reason and freedom alone, humanity could march towards a perfect utopia. The middle classes have always been fond of using such lofty terms to adorn their facade, yet they failed to realize that when they placed the spark of criticism into the hands of a gifted youth, that spark would one day burn their cherished estate to the ground. Following this standard path of elite education, in 1830 Marx was admitted to Trier Grammar School. Shortly thereafter, in 1835, he entered the University of Bonn to study law. His father had high hopes for him, determined to mold him into a respectable, well-paid, and esteemed lawyer. In his father's vision, young Karl would slot perfectly into the cogs of society, becoming a high-grade, well-oiled component within the system's machinery. This was not merely a father's expectation. It was, in fact, the discipline imposed by the big other upon every individual in modern society, to study a practical profession, to obtain a professional qualification, to secure a stable income, and then to spend one's life contentedly within this alienated world. Yet, It is often under the strictest discipline that the neural synapses of the spirit snap. During his time at the University of Bonn, Marx, who ought to have been poring over dry legal texts in the library, behaved with remarkable rebelliousness. Far from becoming the dutiful daughter or model son his father had envisioned, he turned into a troublesome troublemaker, frequently getting into brawls in pubs. How are we to interpret this adolescent restlessness? It was by no means mere youthful impetuosity, but rather an instinctive, defiant existential anxiety, existential angst. When a person subconsciously realizes that the well-paved track leading to so-called success is in fact a conveyor belt to spiritual death, his body rebels before his mind does. Drinking and fighting were a violent rejection of the rigid, hyper-rational norms of bourgeois society. He sought, through the dizziness of alcohol and the physicality of conflict, to affirm that he was still a living, breathing human being, rather than a mere parrot destined for the courtroom of the future. Faced with a son who seemed to be heading towards ruin, his anxious father took action, eventually forcing him to transfer to the University of Berlin. Yet it would never have occurred to this father that it was precisely this decision that thrust Marx into the very eye of the philosophical storm, into an abyss from which there was no turning back. When Marx set foot in the University of Berlin, the institution was shrouded in a vast and suffocating specter. Hegel had passed away only a few years earlier. Hegel had been a professor of philosophy at the university, and indeed its rector. Even after his death, the academic atmosphere at the University of Berlin remained intensely vibrant. One could almost smell the scent of dialectics in the air. Hegel's philosophy was not a simple theory, it was a cosmology that sought to engulf all things. Within his system, human history was nothing more than a grand drama of the absolute spirit's ceaseless self-unfolding and self-realization. Under this heavy shadow, Hegel's thought was divided by his followers into distinct schools, the most notable of which were the young Hegelians and the old Hegelians. The later Hegelians sought to use Hegel's theory to defend the existing Prussian autocratic regime, whilst the young Hegelians held more radical views, attempting to deconstruct the decay of reality with the weapons of criticism. Marx, with his rebellious spirit, did not hesitate to join the young Hegelians whilst at the University of Berlin. He completely abandoned the career in law his father had mapped out for him, devoting vast amounts of time to the frenzied study of philosophy and history. During this process, a pivotal figure emerged, acting much like Virgil guiding Dante into hell. At this time, Marx became utterly captivated by Bruno Bauer's philosophy lectures. Who was Bauer? He was a highly renowned German philosopher, once a fervent adherent of Hegelian philosophy, and one of the leading figures of the young Hegelians. His lectures had an extremely profound influence on Marx. Indeed, in a sense, one could say that without Bauer, there would have been no Marx. Bauer was an extremely radical thinker who, having published works expressing anti-religious ideas at the time, angered the authorities and was subsequently ruthlessly dismissed from the university. This image of a martyr persecuted by secular power for upholding the truth deeply shook the young Marx. Bauer's ideas were like a sharp scalpel, cutting open the first fissure of critical thought in the young Marx's mind and profoundly shaping him. Inspired by Bauer, Marx sought to draw his sword in his doctoral thesis, directly advancing the radical position that philosophy takes precedence over theology. In an era when religious forces remained formidable, such a declaration was tantamount to heresy. Unsurprisingly, this overly provocative stance was subsequently rejected by the examination board. Yet this could not halt the awakening of a mind. Finally, in 1841, Marx sidestepped direct theological conflict and formally obtained his Doctor of Philosophy degree with a profound essay entitled The Difference Between the Natural Philosophy of Democritus and That of Epicurus. Behind this essay, which ostensibly explored ancient Greek atomism, Marx was in fact examining the ultimate conflict between free will and mechanical determinism. He was no longer content to be a scholar passively absorbing knowledge in his study. He sought the force capable of shattering fatalism and allowing atoms to deviate freely. Dialectical synthesis. Let us pause to examine this absurd yet inevitable historical opening. Marx's early experiences perfectly exemplify a Hegelian negation of the negation. It was precisely because his middle-class upbringing provided a comfortable material foundation and an education steeped in enlightenment thought that he was granted the privilege of transcending existential anxiety to contemplate the fate of all humanity. Yet it was precisely this awakening of reason that drove him to instinctively rebel against the bourgeois symbolic order that had laid out a comfortable path for him. He descended from a law student with high hopes to a vagrant in a tavern, only to be reborn amidst the fervent philosophical speculation at the University of Berlin as a doctor wielding the blade of critique. He was in the process of undergoing the first agonizing rupture of his class identity, yet, armed with his PhD in philosophy, could Marx truly change the world? When he stepped out of the university's ivory tower, sheltered by the absolute spirit, and collided head-on with the ruthless Prussian political machine and the harsh reality of poverty, what kind of shattering and reconstruction would he undergo? The philosophical patricide and the collision with the real. Picture the scene. It is 1841, and a young man clutching a freshly minted PhD in philosophy steps out of the hollowed, echo-filled halls of the university and onto the cold, unforgiving cobblestones of the mid-19th century. He is armed to the teeth with the most sophisticated intellectual weaponry of his age, the dialectics of Hegel, the radical atheism of the young Hegelians, the absolute conviction that if you simply expose the logical fallacies of a corrupt society, that society will inevitably collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. This is the ultimate liberal fantasy, isn't it? It is a fantasy that persists even today, poisoning our modern political discourse. We constantly fall into the trap of believing that if we just write the perfect tweet, if we just expose the hypocrisy of the ruling class with enough eloquence, or if we just win the debate in the marketplace of ideas, the world will magically heal itself. The young Karl Marx believed this too. He believed in the supreme power of the symbolic order, the realm of ideas, words, and rational discourse. Driven by this fiery idealism, Marx did not retreat into academia. Instead, he threw himself into the trenches of journalism, becoming an editor and eventually the editor-in-chief of the Rheinische Zeitung. You can almost smell the intoxicating scent of lead type and cheap ink. The late nights spent furiously scribbling polemics by the dim light of a gas lamp. He weaponized his intellect, publishing blistering articles that dared to directly criticize the oppressive regime of the Russian Tsar. He thought he was striking a fatal blow for human freedom. He thought the sheer moral and logical force of his arguments would bring the autocrats to their knees. Instead, he collided headfirst with what Jacques Lacan would later call the traumatic real. The Russian Tsar did not engage Marx in a polite philosophical debate. He didn't write a counter-editorial. The Tsar simply sent a furious protest to the Prussian king, and the king, bowing to raw, unadulterated geopolitical power, did not care about the Hegelian unfolding of the absolute spirit. In 1843, the Prussian government unilaterally revoked the publishing license of the Rheinische Zeitung. Just like that, the printing presses stopped. The paper was dead. Marx was abruptly unemployed. This moment of sudden, humiliating silence is the true crucible of Marxist philosophy. It is one thing to read about power in a textbook. It is an entirely different, terrifying experience when the iron fist of the state smashes your livelihood into pieces simply because you said something inconvenient. For Marx, this was not just a career setback. It was a profound, world-shattering epistemological crisis. The Hegelian illusion evaporated in an instant. Hegel had taught that the state was the highest embodiment of rationality and ethics, but the Prussian state had just acted as the cowardly lapdog of a foreign tyrant. How could this be rational? How could ideas rule the world when a single stroke of a monarch's pen could silence the most brilliant ideas overnight? It was during this period of forced exile and deep disillusionments, spanning roughly from 1843 to 1846, that Marx executed a violent, 180-degree philosophical turn. He began to realize that the entire framework of idealism was a catastrophic error. To survive this intellectual vertigo, Marx had to commit philosophical patricide. He had to intellectually slaughter the very mentors who had shaped his mind. In a series of groundbreaking texts written between 1843 and 1844, including On the Jewish Question and Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Marx turned his scalpel against the young Hegelians, aiming specifically at his former idol, Bruno Bauer. Bauer and his intellectual circle were obsessed with the idea that human liberation was fundamentally a religious and theological problem. They argued that if you could just free people from the illusion of religion, you would free them entirely. Marx looked at this and saw the purest form of intellectual cowardice. He realized that Bauer was blaming the chains of the oppressed on the idea of the chains, rather than the cold, heavy iron they were actually made of. As Lenin would later astutely point out, these essays marked the definitive turning point where Marx shed the skin of idealism and embraced materialism. But this journey into the material world was not something Marx undertook alone. In the midst of this chaotic transition, he met the man who would become his lifelong friend, his financial savior, and his indispensable intellectual partner, Friedrich Engels. Engels was a man who did not just read about capitalism. He managed a textile factory in Manchester. He had seen the child laborers, the amputated limbs, the horrific slums. When the speculative brilliance of Marx met the grim, empirical reality of Engels, the fusion was explosive. Together, between 1845 and 1846, they drafted texts that would change the trajectory of human history, notably the German ideology and the legendary theses on Feuerbach. Even though these manuscripts were not published in their lifetimes, they contained the radioactive core of a completely new worldview. However, Marx's destructive path wasn't finished. After destroying Bauer, he had to confront Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach was the darling of the new materialists. He had famously argued that God did not create man, but that man created God as a projection of his own alienated essence. Feuerbach proclaimed that nature and matter were primary, and that spirit was secondary. This initially heavily influenced Marx. But as Marx stared deeper into the abyss of human suffering, he realized that Feuerbach's materialism was fatally flawed. It was, as Marx diagnosed, a static, mechanical, and vulgar materialism. Feuerbach looked at a human being the way a biologist looks at a frog on a dissection table, as an isolated biological object, a passive observer of the physical world. Marx realized that humanity is not just a biological species standing outside of nature looking in. Humans interact with nature. We dig into the earth. We build fires. We forge steel. This interaction is called praxis practical, material human activity. Feuerbach completely failed to understand history as a dynamic process driven by this very practice. Feuerbach said, "God is an illusion. Let's teach people to think rationally," Marx replied. "But why do people need this illusion in the first place? People cling to the illusion of heaven because their material reality on earth is an unbearable hell. You cannot simply educate away their pain. You cannot cure a man's hunger by handing him a pamphlet on the chemistry of digestion." This leads us to the monumental birth of historical materialism. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels systematically laid out the architecture of a new way of seeing the world. They established the core principle: it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. The foundational premise of all human history is that before men can do art, religion, or philosophy, they must first eat, drink, find shelter, and clothe themselves. Therefore, the mode of production, the way a society organizes itself to survive, is the invisible scaffolding upon which all laws, religions, and moralities are built. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This final sentence from his theses on Feuerbach is not just a call to action. It is the epitaph for thousands of years of Western philosophy. Marx realized that philosophy itself, when divorced from material struggle, is merely an ideological coping mechanism, a way to make the unbearable conditions of reality seem rational and acceptable. Dialectical synthesis. The transition from the young Hegelian to the revolutionary materialist is the terrifying realization that ideology is not a pair of glasses you can simply take off. You cannot think your way out of a prison if you are entirely dependent on the prison guards for your next meal. Modern society tells us that our freedom resides in our minds, in our mindfulness apps, in our positive thinking, in our curated digital avatars. But Marx's brutal intervention reveals that as long as the material conditions of our survival are controlled by an alienating system, Our supposed spiritual freedom is nothing but the phantom twitching of an amputated limb. True enlightenment is not a state of mind. It is the physical act of dismantling the machinery that grinds our humanity into dust. But what exactly is this machinery? And how does the very act of working to survive end up transforming us into monsters to ourselves? The exile, the abyss, and the birth of a specter. Imagine, for a moment, the suffocating, sulfurous smog of Victorian London in the early 1850s. This is not the romanticized fog of a Sherlock Holmes novel. This is the literal exhaust of the industrial meat grinder, a thick haze of coal smoke that coats the lungs of the proletariat and blots out the sun. Now, zoom in through that choking darkness, past the roaring textile mills, past the glittering facades of the new financial district, and into a cramped, freezing, disease-ridden apartment on Dean Street in the slums of Soho. There, sitting at a wobbly wooden table surrounded by pawn tickets and unpaid bread bills, is a man whose name will soon make empires tremble. He is coughing violently. His coat has been pawned to buy potatoes, and in the next room, his wife is weeping over a tiny, lifeless body. This is not a fictional melodrama. This is the visceral, horrifying, traumatic real that Karl Marx was forced to inhabit. The man who was meticulously decoding the hidden architecture of global wealth was ironically and tragically being crushed to death by it. To understand how he ended up in this abyss, we must rewind the tape to the explosive climax of the late 1840s. Marx had already committed philosophical patricide, abandoning the empty debates of the young Hegelians for a radical new materialist worldview. But theory without action is just intellectual masturbation. In 1847, Marx and his indispensable shadow, Friedrich Engels, were invited to join a clandestine group known as the League of the Just. They did not join to simply participate, they joined to intellectually hijack the organization. By June of 1847, they had successfully transformed this vaguely utopian society into something sharp, modern, and lethal, the Communist League. Then came the turning point, February 1848. Marx and Engels drafted the programmatic document for this league, a text that would become a cultural virus injected directly into the mainframe of human history, the Communist Manifesto. This thin pamphlet officially marked the birth of Marxism. It was not a dry political treatise. It was a Gothic horror story disguised as economics. A specter is haunting Europe, it began. Marx recognized that capitalism was a necromantic force, a system of dead labor capital that acts like a vampire, only surviving by sucking the living labor of the working class. Almost exactly as the ink dried on the manifesto, reality itself seemed to obey Marx's script. In 1848, the European continent spectacularly erupted into a massive revolution. This was not a localized riot. It was a titanic transnational collision between plebeians and nobles, a desperate struggle where European commoners and liberal scholars waged an armed resistance against entrenched military dictatorships. The flames of rebellion engulfed almost the entirety of Europe, etching it into the annals as one of the largest revolutionary movements in European history. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed as though the symbolic order of the old monarchies was shattering. But the empire always strikes back. When the reactionary forces regrouped and crushed the uprisings with military steel, the ideological architects of the revolution became prime targets. Marx, perceived as a highly dangerous intellectual contagion, was unceremoniously expelled by the Belgian authorities. For a fleeting moment, under the invitation of the newly formed French provisional government, Marx, his wife, and Engels retreated to the revolutionary hotbed of Paris. But stability was an illusion. As the revolutionary tide receded, European governments collaborated in a coordinated witch hunt. Marx was chased across borders like a fugitive, forced into a perpetual state of exile by governments terrified of his pen. Marx and his family were plunged into a prolonged nightmare of displacement and extreme, crushing poverty. This brings us back to that freezing apartment in London. During these dark years, Marx possessed no stable employment whatsoever. The family's sole economic lifeline was tethered to the meager, unpredictable income he generated from writing freelance articles. Without a reliable source of money, Marx was subjected to the relentless, degrading torment of starvation and primal survival. He was not merely hungry, he was systematically broken down by the very socio-economic machine he was trying to dismantle. He lacked proper clothing to brave the cold, and severe illnesses ravaged his exhausted physical body. But the true tragedy, the pain that transcends any political theory, was the cost exacted upon his family. In the suffocating grip of this squalor, out of his 4 children, 3 tragically died prematurely, their fragile lives extinguished by poverty and disease before they could even truly begin. Let us pause here and strip away the academic detachment. Imagine the profound psychological agony of this situation. Here is a man of unparalleled genius, a man who understands the flow of global capital better than the bankers in the city of London, yet he cannot afford medicine for his dying child. Under such devastating circumstances, most men would surrender. They would abandon their radical theories, beg for a clerical job, and submit to the system to save whatever was left of their family. But Marx did not break. He weaponized his grief. His suffering became the ultimate horrific validation of his own theories. He realized with agonizing clarity that the capitalist system does not merely exploit. It exercises what modern philosophers call necropolitics, the power to dictate who gets to live and who is forced to die. His children were collateral damage in the invisible wars of capital accumulation. And yet, he would not have survived this underworld journey without a savior. Enter the ultimate historical paradox, Friedrich Engels. During this darkest timeline, Engels provided an immense, almost incomprehensible level of assistance, constantly sacrificing his own resources to fund Marx's basic living expenses. As Lenin would later astutely observe, if Engels had not selflessly sacrificed himself to provide this relentless financial lifeline, Marx would not only have failed to write his magnum opus, Capital, but he would have undoubtedly perished in absolute poverty. This supreme act of sacrifice forged a revolutionary friendship between Marx and Engels that transcends history and has been passed down as a legendary epic. Think about the sheer dizzying irony of this dynamic. Engels, who managed a highly profitable textile mill in Manchester, was extracting surplus value from the very proletariat that Marx was writing about, only to funnel those capitalist profits directly into the pockets of the man who was designing the blueprint to destroy capitalism itself. It is a perfect Zizkian paradox, the capitalist system unknowingly funding its own ultimate gravedigger. Through this agonizing crucible, Marx slowly rebuilt his intellectual fortress. He spent his days in the reading room of the British Museum, obsessively poring over economic reports, transforming his raw anger into cold, hard scientific analysis. His political exile did not isolate him entirely. In September 1864, he attended the inaugural meeting of the First International, where he was elected to its leading committee, re-entering the arena of organized labor. Finally, after years of blood, sweat, and the ashes of his own family, the ultimate weapon was unleashed. On the 14th of September, 1867, the first volume of Capital, Das Kapital, was published. This monumental text was not just an economic treatise, guided entirely by the fundamental principles of historical materialism, and centering precisely on the concept of surplus value. It delivered a devastating total critique of the capitalist system. He meticulously mapped out the basic theories of commodity production, circulation, and distribution, dragging the objective laws of economic development out of the shadows and into the glaring light of day, an achievement of truly epoch-making historical significance. Capital is dead labor that, vampire-like, only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. He had survived the abyss. He had taken the agonizing reality of his dead children, his pawned winter coat, and his bleeding lungs, and transmuted them into a weapon of mass intellectual destruction. Dialectical synthesis. The tragic narrative of Marx's exile forces us to confront a brutal truth about the architecture of human thought. Profound truth is rarely generated in the sterile comfort of a university office. The creation of Capital represents the ultimate dialectical collision between the ideological and the material. Marx's theoretical brilliance. The thesis was violently tested against the absolute material deprivation of the London slums. The antithesis. The synthesis was not a compromised, softer theory. Rather, it was a hardened, hyper-lucid structural analysis of the very machine that was torturing him. He proved that to truly dissect the monster of capitalism, one cannot simply observe it from the safety of an ivory tower. One must be actively digested in its belly, feeling the burning acid of its systemic logic, and still possess the sheer willpower to map its internal organs. But what exactly did he find inside the belly of this beast? Beyond just poverty, what is the invisible psychological poison that this system injects into the modern worker? Why do you, sitting at your desk today, feel so fundamentally disconnected from your own life? The pinnacle and the hidden crisis, the alchemy of alienation. Why does the world you created rule over you? Look closely at your hands as they rest upon your keyboard. Whose hands are those? Really, during the 8, 10, or perhaps 12 hours a day you spend furiously typing emails, compiling reports, or writing code. Do those hands belong to you? Or are they merely rented extensions of a corporate mainframe? Welcome back to the Abyss. Today we are going to dissect a word that has become a fashionable cliché in modern society, a word we toss around casually when complaining about our jobs over overpriced lats. That word is alienation. 异化. You hear people constantly saying, "I am alienated by my work," or "My life has been alienated by society." But what does this actually mean? To understand the profound horror of this concept, we must strip away the modern pop psychology buzzwords and return to the philosophical ground zero established by Karl Marx in his early, deeply existential writings. While the German ideology only mentions the word alienation twice, this concept is absolutely the radioactive core of Marx's early philosophical thought. It serves as the vital starting point for his entire intellectual edifice. But Marx did not simply invent this term out of thin air. It is a German word with roots stretching back to ancient Greek, signifying a process where the subject becomes an other and becomes estranged from itself. In the realm of philosophy, it was the Titan G.W.F. Hegel who elevated this concept from everyday language into a profound philosophical category. Hegel viewed alienation as a necessary, almost positive unfolding, the absolute spirit objectifying itself into the world, creating an alien reality, only to eventually recognize itself in that creation and return to itself. Then came Ludwig Feuerbach, who radically modified this concept to critique religion. Feuerbach argued that theology had it entirely backward. God did not create man, rather, man created God by alienating his own greatest qualities, reason, love, and will, and projecting them onto a fictional infinite being in the sky. By doing so, humanity impoverished itself, bowing down to an illusion of its own making. Feuerbach's alienation was a purely psychological and religious tragedy, a state where the individual loses their true self to a phantom. Marx absorbed these theories, but he realized they were still trapped in the ethereal realm of ideas. He took Feuerbach's theological critique and violently dragged it down into the filthy, deafening reality of the industrial factory floor. In his Paris manuscripts, Marx systematically demonstrated how the true horror of capitalism is not just poverty, but a fundamental mutilation of the human soul. He mapped out the psychic destruction through 4 distinct, escalating stages of alienated labor. Let us walk through these 4 circles of the modern worker's hell. The first stage is the alienation of the product of labor. Imagine an artisan. When a carpenter carves a chair, they leave a piece of their soul in the wood. The object is an expression of their identity. But under industrial capitalism, this relationship is severed. Marx observed that the worker pours their very life force into the object they produce, but once created, their life no longer belongs to them. It belongs to the object. And worse, this object is immediately stolen or appropriated by the capitalist. The product of their own sweat and blood becomes an alien, independent power that stands utterly opposed to them. Translate this to our digital age. You spend months coding an algorithm or designing a marketing campaign. You pour your late nights, your stress, and your intellect into this digital product. But the moment it is finished, it belongs to the shareholders. It becomes part of a ubiquitous system that might eventually be used to optimize away your own job or to manipulate your own consumption habits through targeted ads. The world you physically built becomes a hostile architecture designed to control you. This breaks the fundamental, primal relationship between humanity and nature. This leads us to the second, even more visceral stage, the alienation of the act of production. If the product is alienated, then the very act of making it must also be a form of self-estrangement. Marx diagnosed that under the wage system, Work is never voluntary. It is entirely coerced. The worker does not fulfill themselves in their labor, but actively denies themselves. They feel physically exhausted and mentally debased, experiencing their daily routine not as creative expression, but as a form of suffering and torture. Is this not the exact psychological profile of the modern burnout society? We experience a profound inversion of our reality. Marx noted the tragic irony that the worker only feels freely active, only feels truly human, in their basic animal functions, eating, drinking, and procreating. Meanwhile, in their uniquely human function, the act of creative, purposeful labor, they are reduced to the status of a machine or an animal. We flee the office to binge and watch Netflix and consume junk food, desperately trying to feel alive in our passive consumption, precisely because our active production has turned us into literal corporate beasts of burdens. Nyoma. We are completely alienated from ourselves. But Marx drills even deeper. The third stage is the alienation from species jian being le benzhi. This is perhaps the most philosophically devastating point. What makes a human being different from a bee building a hive or a beaver building a dam? Marx argued that our species jian being the essence of humanity as a whole is characterized by free, conscious activity. An animal only produces when driven by direct, immediate physical necessity. But a human being can produce free from physical need. We can shape the world according to the laws of beauty, creating art, science, and culture. We have the capacity to consciously reproduce the entire universe in our minds and through our hands. Capitalism, however, hijacks this divine spark. Alienated labor turns our defining characteristic, our free, conscious, creative life activity, into a mere instrument, a basic tool solely for maintaining our physical existence. We don't work to express our humanity. We work simply to survive, paying rent and buying groceries. The very trait that elevates us above the animal kingdom is weaponized against us, stripping away our fundamental human essence. Finally, the inevitable culmination of these tragic fractures is the fourth stage, the alienation of man from man. When a person is alienated from their product, from their own life activity, and from their human essence, the direct and unavoidable consequence is that they become alienated from every other human being. We no longer look at our fellow workers as brothers and sisters in the human struggle. Instead, we view them through the cold, calculated logic of the market. In the modern corporate office, your colleague is not a fellow human. They are an obstacle to your promotion, a metric to be outperformed, or an object whose labor is simply bought and sold. We are trapped in a Hegelian war of all against all, but it is masked by polite corporate emails and mandatory team building exercises. This is how the system perfectly insulates itself, by ensuring that the oppressed view each other as enemies rather than allies. The architecture of exploitation remains completely invisible and eternally secure. Dialectical synthesis. Let us synthesize this nightmare. The brilliance of Marx's early philosophy lies in his realization that alienation is not merely a subjective feeling of sadness or dissatisfaction. It is an objective structural reality generated by the division of labor and private property. Unlike Feuerbach, who saw alienation as an isolated static psychological error, Marx mapped it as a dynamic systemic process that shapes all of human history. Today, this alienation has evolved from the factory floor into the hyperreality of digital capitalism. We have created a global communication network designed to connect everyone, yet we are suffering from unprecedented levels of loneliness and psychological isolation. Why? Because the very platforms we use to connect are themselves alienated products, algorithms designed not to foster human flourishing, but to extract our attention as surplus value. We willingly surrender our data, our desires, and our time to the machine, actively participating in our own subjugation. We have become the ultimate dialectical contradiction, the creators of a godlike technology who live entirely at the mercy of our own creation. But if we are so thoroughly entangled in this web of alienated labor and social division, is there any escape? If human history is driven by this very process, how does the machine finally begin to break down? The eve of collapse, the curse of the division of labor and the mutilation of the modern subject. Let us begin by shattering the greatest ideological illusion of the 21st century, the myth of the autonomous, self-made individual. You have been told since childhood that you are a unique universe unto yourself, a sovereign mind encased in flesh, freely navigating the marketplace of life. You are encouraged to find yourself, to build your personal brand, and to express your inner essence through the commodities you purchase and the curated photos you upload to the digital void. But what if this highly celebrated individuality is nothing more than a carefully engineered hallucination? What if the self you are so desperately trying to optimize does not actually exist in the way you think it does? To unravel this terrifying possibility, we must return to a brilliant, fragmentary manuscript written by Karl Marx in 1845, known as the Theses on Feuerbach. This document, containing a mere 1,400 words, was never published during Marx's lifetime and was only discovered and released by Engels long after his death. Yet, Engels accurately described it as the first document containing the brilliant germ of a new worldview. In these brief, explosive notes, Marx asked a seemingly simple question: what is the true essence of a human being? Before Marx, philosophers like Ludwig Feuerbach attempted to answer this by looking inward. Feuerbach argued that human essence was defined by an internal combination of cognitive power, willpower, and the capacity for love. He believed the fundamental difference between man and animal was that humans possessed a conscious awareness of their own species. But Marx looked at this abstract, biological definition and realized it was fatally incomplete. Marx declared that the essence of man is not an abstraction inherent in each single individual. Instead, in its reality, human essence is the absolute sum of social relations. Let that sink in. You are not a solitary atom possessing an innate, unchanging human nature. You are the nexus point of a vast, invisible web of social and economic interactions. To understand a human being, you cannot place them under a microscope in a laboratory. You must place them within the brutal, unfolding reality of human history and the specific social structures they inhabit. If you change the underlying social relations, the way we produce, consume, and interact to survive, you fundamentally change what it means to be human. But how did these social relations become so toxic? How did the web of human connection turn into a steel cage? To answer this, in his foundational text, The German Ideology, Marx largely abandoned the highly philosophical term alienation and replaced it with a much more concrete, visceral, and historically grounded mechanism, the division of labor. Marx argued that human history truly began with the first historical act, the production of the means to satisfy basic human needs, the production of material life itself. In order to eat, drink, and find shelter, humans had to organize themselves. As societies grew more complex, this organization inevitably fractured into specialized tasks. The division of labor is the true engine of historical development, driving society through different epochs, from primitive tribal ownership to ancient communal and state ownership, to feudalism, and ultimately to the nightmare of modern capitalism. At every stage, the division of labor dictated the unequal distribution of wealth and gave birth to the concept of private property. However, the division of labor is not merely an economic strategy to increase efficiency, it is an existential curse. Marx illustrated this with a hauntingly prescient observation. He noted that as long as the division of labor is not voluntary but comes about naturally through the blind forces of survival, man's own deed becomes an alien power opposed to him, which enslaves him instead of being controlled by him. Imagine the dawn of this division. A person is forced into an exclusive sphere of activity, a specific lane they cannot escape. They become a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critical critic, and they must absolutely remain in that designated role if they do not want to lose their means of livelihood. Now, strip away the 19th century terminology and map this onto your reality today. The algorithm of modern capitalism demands extreme specialization. You are no longer a complete human being. You are a data analyst, an Uber driver, a marketing executive, or a content moderator. This role is violently imposed upon you by the threat of starvation and homelessness. You are trapped within a microscopic silo of activity, performing repetitive, fragmented tasks that hold no inherent meaning for you. You are not exploring the vast, multifaceted potential of your human intellect. You are a highly optimized, materialized component in a global supply chain. You have been reduced from the sum of social relations to a mere fraction of a human being. The psychological devastation of this fragmentation is absolute. When millions of individuals are forced into these highly specialized, involuntary roles, their combined labor generates an unimaginable social force, a multiplied productive power. But here is the ultimate dialectical nightmare, because this massive cooperation is not a voluntary association of free individuals. This immense social power does not appear to the workers as their own united strength. Instead, it confronts them as a totally alien, hostile, and independent force. They have absolutely no idea where this power comes from or where it is going. They cannot control it. On the contrary, this monstrous force born from their own collective sweat takes on a life of its own, passing through a peculiar series of phases and stages independent of the will of humanity, eventually coming to directly dominate and direct human behavior. Think about the global financial markets, the terrifying fluctuations of inflation, the sudden waves of corporate layoffs, or the relentless march of artificial intelligence threatening to automate your existence. These are not acts of God. They are the mutated, alienated forms of our own collective productive power, turning back to crush the very people who generated them. We look at the economy the way ancient civilizations looked at a thunderstorm, as an unpredictable, terrifying deity that must be appeased with human sacrifices. We have built a machine so vast and complex that we have become completely subjugated by its operating system. Marx saw this catastrophe unfolding and realized that society was rapidly approaching the eve of its own collapse. The contradiction between the increasingly socialized nature of global production and the narrow private appropriation of its fruits was reaching a breaking point. The system was generating unprecedented wealth, yet simultaneously plunging the masses into a state of precarious, alienated desperation. The very forces of production were rebelling against the relations of production. For Marx, the only logical scientific resolution to this impending doom was the total abolition of this involuntary division of labor. He envisioned a future communist society where society itself regulates the general production, making it entirely possible for an individual to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, and criticize after dinner, just as they have a mind without ever being forced to become a professional hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. The goal was not mere economic equality. The ultimate historical task was the total liberation of the human being from the prison of the division of labor, allowing for the free, comprehensive development of every individual. Dialectical synthesis. The tragedy of the modern subject is the tragedy of an amputated existence. We are taught to revere the division of labor as the supreme catalyst for technological progress. Yet we remain willfully blind to the fact that it achieves this progress by systematically dismembering the human soul. Capitalism separates the mind from the hand, the creator from the creation, and the individual from the community. It transforms the vibrant, dynamic sum of social relations into a desolate marketplace of competing commodities. The ultimate liberation, therefore, is not merely a redistribution of wealth, but a radical reconstitution of the human subject itself, a reclaiming of the alienated social forces so that humanity can finally step out of its prehistoric night and into the dawn of true self-determined history. But as this monumental theoretical framework was finally crystallized in the pages of Capital, the man who bore the agonizing weight of its creation was quietly approaching the end of his physical journey. How did the world react when the architect of its ultimate critique finally closed his eyes? The final ending, the silence of the apartment, the lonely funeral, and the unfinished mystery of Capital. Picture the quiet, suffocating stillness of a room where a titan has finally collapsed under the colossal weight of his own thoughts. We have spent the previous chapters navigating the roaring machinery of the Industrial Revolution, the chaotic barricades of 1848, and the agonizing, freezing slums of exile. But now, the noise abruptly stops. We arrive at the ultimate, inescapable horizon of the traumatic real, the inevitable decay of the biological body. It is a profound philosophical irony that the man who dedicated his entire existence to decoding the material reality of human history was, in the end, violently betrayed by his own material biology. Let us turn our gaze to the monumental year of 1867, On the 14th of September of that year, after decades of excruciating intellectual labor and unimaginable personal tragedy, the first volume of Capital, Das Kapital, was finally published. This was not merely a book. It was an act of intellectual terrorism against the ruling class. Guided fundamentally by the principles of historical materialism, Marx utilized the concept of surplus value as his absolute center to deliver a total, devastating critique of capitalism. He did not just complain about inequality, he meticulously mapped out the basic theories of capitalist commodity production, its global circulation, and its deeply flawed distribution systems. He dragged the objective laws of economic development out from behind the ideological curtain, an achievement of truly epoch-making historical significance. But here is where the narrative fractures into a haunting, unresolved chord. Capital was a masterpiece, but it was a fundamentally incomplete one. The latter two volumes of this colossal critique were not published during Marx's lifetime. They were painstakingly organized and published by Friedrich Engels only after Marx's death. Why did this magnum opus remain unfinished? Traditional historians might blame his failing health or his relentless perfectionism. But from a philosophical perspective, there is a much darker, much more profound reason. The unfinished nature of capital is not a bug in the Marxist system. It is its ultimate, terrifying feature. How can you write the final definitive chapter on a system that is inherently designed to constantly mutate, expand, and consume everything in its path? Capitalism is a necrotic virus that continuously rewrites its own genetic code to survive every crisis. Marx's inability to finish his work perfectly mirrors the agonizing reality that the struggle against the symbolic order of capital is an endless, exhausting, and perpetually unfolding process. The unfinished pages of Capital are a glaring, empty void, a void that demands the active participation of every subsequent generation to fill with their own revolutionary praxis. As the years ground on, the fire that had once threatened to consume the European continent was slowly suffocating inside a frail, exhausted shell. The man who had diagnosed the alienation of the entire human race was now facing the ultimate, total alienation, death itself. In March of 1883, the great thinker Karl Marx breathed his last, passing away in his apartment in Paris. You must pause and fully absorb the devastating, almost pathetic starkness of this moment. Let the cinematic grandeur fade away. There were no massive crowds holding red banners outside his window. There were no national days of mourning. There was only the heavy, quiet dust of a cluttered room and the profound grief of a fiercely loyal few. The man who had meticulously drafted the blueprint for a global, world-shattering revolution died in the quiet obscurity of a private residence. The funeral that followed is a scene of such absolute Zizkian absurdity that it perfectly encapsulates the paradox of his entire existence. The ceremony was hosted by his lifelong partner in intellectual arms, Friedrich Engels. But look at the crowd gathered to bury the architect of the future. At that time, only about 20 people attended Marx's funeral. 20 people. Imagine that number. In today's hyper-connected, dopamine-driven digital economy, a teenager posting a mildly amusing dance video on TikTok can garner 20,000 viewers in a matter of seconds. Yet, the man whose ideas would go on to shape the geopolitical destiny of the 20th century, the man whose philosophical specter would eventually mobilize billions of people across continents, the man whose very name would become the ultimate dividing line of global history. This man was lowered into the cold earth with an audience of merely 24 souls. How do we philosophically reconcile this massive, crushing discrepancy between the physical insignificance of his death and the monumental, earth-shattering scale of his legacy? This is where we must apply the lens of psychoanalysis. Jacques Lacan teaches us that the physical body, the biological organism that eats, breathes, and suffers, must be completely separated from the symbolic dimension of the subject. During his lifetime, Karl Marx the man was a vulnerable biological entity. He was a man who suffered from boils, who begged for money, who wept over his dead children, and who was repeatedly crushed by the grinding machinery of the state. As long as he was alive, he was trapped in the messy, contradictory, and painful realm of the real. But the moment the dirt hit his coffin, a profound alchemical transmutation occurred. His physical death was the absolute prerequisite for his ideological immortality. By dying, Marx, the vulnerable human being, was completely annihilated, allowing Marxism, the indestructible spectral idea, to be fully born. He was no longer a coughing, impoverished exile in a damp apartment. He was uploaded into the grand structural framework of human history as an immortal floating signifier. The tragedy of the 20 people at his funeral is not a testament to his failure. It is the ultimate proof that the truth he uncovered was so overwhelmingly massive, so terrifyingly radical, that his own physical reality could never possibly contain it. Dialectical synthesis. Let us synthesize the silence of the grave. The death of Karl Marx represents the ultimate dialectical tension between the finite biological subject and the infinite reach of systemic thought. His uncompleted manuscript of Capital and his sparsely attended funeral serve as a brutal reminder that true philosophical disruption is rarely rewarded with contemporary applause. In a society completely addicted to the immediate gratification of the spectacle, profound, structural truth always appears initially as a lonely, isolated failure. However, this physical absence is exactly what allowed his thought to detach from its European 19th century origins and become a universal ghost. The quietness of his death in 1883 was merely the pulling back of the bowstring. The arrow had been released, soaring silently through the dark, waiting to strike the heart of empires that did not even exist yet. But where would this specter land? How did a theory forged in the industrial smog of Western Europe cross oceans and mountains, only to find its most fertile, explosive soil in the ancient, agrarian civilization of the East? Chapter 8. The Aftermath and Influence, the Spectre's Eastern Odyssey, the deep ontological resonance of historical materialism, and the Great Harmony. Let us confront one of the most spectacular, ironic geographical displacements in the history of human thought. If you read classical Marxist theory like a mechanical blueprint, a profound paradox immediately emerges, one that has baffled Western academics for over a century. Karl Marx, sitting in the smog-choked heart of the British Empire, meticulously calculated that the proletarian revolution would inevitably erupt in the most highly developed capitalist centers, London, Paris, or Berlin. The logic dictated that capitalism had to fully mature, rot, and collapse under its own contradictions before the communist phoenix could rise from its ashes. Yet, history is a master of the Zizkian plot twist. The specter of communism did not successfully possess the industrialized West. Instead, it drifted like a phantom across the vast Eurasian landmass, bypassing the glowing factories of the Occident, and found its most explosive, fertile soil in the ancient, agrarian, and deeply traditional civilizations of the East, most notably in China. How do we explain this monumental historical deviation? Was it merely a political accident, a desperate geopolitical Hail Mary passed by a crumbling nation? Absolutely not. To understand why Marxism violently took root in China, we must look beyond mere political strategy and dive deep into the ontological bedrock of both systems. We are talking about a profound, almost terrifying structural resonance between a 19th century German philosophical critique and a 2000-year-old Asian civilizational code. To set the stage, we must immerse ourselves in the apocalyptic atmosphere of early 20th century China, following the Xinhai Revolution, which violently terminated the absolute rule of the Qing dynasty. The nation did not peacefully transition into a liberal democracy. Instead, it plunged into a chaotic, fragmented nightmare of warlordism and intense localized social conflict. The symbolic order of a millennia-old empire had completely shattered, leaving a terrifying ideological vacuum. In a desperate attempt to reconstruct reality, the intellectual elites launched the New Culture movement and the subsequent May 4th movement, desperately trying to import Western liberalism, science, and democracy to fend off imperialism and feudalism. But classical Western liberalism, with its obsession with the atomized, isolated individual, felt alien and impotent in a society bleeding out from collective structural collapse. They needed a weapon of mass ideological reconstruction. They needed a totalizing theory that could simultaneously explain their historical humiliation and provide a scientific roadmap for redemption. Then came the rupture. As the famous historical adage goes, the cannons of the 191 the 7th of October Revolution in Russia brought Marxism-Leninism to China. The victory of the October Revolution acted as a massive epistemological shockwave, proving to Chinese intellectuals that an alternative to Western capitalist imperialism was not only theoretically possible, but practically achievable. It offered a radically new systematic framework to unify a fractured society. But here is the crucial philosophical crux. A foreign ideology cannot take root unless the host body already possesses compatible receptor sites. Why did the Chinese civilizational matrix accept this radical German ideology so seamlessly? First, consider the foundational worldview. In the West, the dominant philosophical tradition, from Plato's realm of ideal forms to Christian theology, all the way to Kant and Hegel, has always been heavily infected by idealism. The West is obsessed with the transcendental big other, a reality that exists outside and above the material world. However, traditional Chinese philosophy, whether it is Confucianism, Taoism, or Moism, has almost universally maintained a fundamentally materialist orientation toward the world. The Chinese philosophical tradition is intrinsically grounded in the here and now, focused on the empirical, lived reality of the human community. Therefore, Marx's historical materialism, which grounds all human consciousness in material reality, did not feel like a foreign invasion. It felt like a sophisticated, modernized articulation of an ancient indigenous worldview. Furthermore, let us examine the concept of history itself. Mainstream Confucian thought places supreme importance on history, tradition, and the continuity of human experience. This maps flawlessly onto Marx's historical materialism, which views human progress not as random events, but as a structured, sequential evolution of epochs. Similarly, the core mechanism of Marxist analysis, materialist dialectics, found an ancient, welcoming echo in Taoism. The Taoist philosophy of nature, with its endless dynamic interplay of yin and yang, represents a primal natural dialectic that shares a profound structural affinity with Marxist dialectical thought. But the resonance goes even deeper, straight into the ethical and political core of human existence. The Western capitalist subject is the ultimate isolated node in a competitive network, a solitary consumer driven by self-interest. Marx's entire project was a revolt against this alienation, a demand to return humanity to its true essence as the sum of social relations. He sought the emancipation of all humanity and the establishment of a communist utopia. For a Chinese intellectual reading this in the 1920s, this was not a radical, terrifying erasure of the self. This was an electrifying return to the highest ideals of their own antiquity. Marx's communist vision aligned with terrifying precision with the traditional Chinese concept of Tianxia Wei Gong. All under heaven belongs to the public, and the pursuit of the Datang Great Harmony Society. The Marxist emphasis on collectivism and a people-centric approach perfectly mirrored traditional Chinese philosophies of statecraft. The Marxist values of equality, mutual aid, and solidarity mapped seamlessly onto the Confucian ethical pillars of benevolence and righteousness. Finally, there is the question of praxis. Marx violently rejected the ivory tower, famously declaring that philosophers must change the world, not just interpret it. He elevated material labor to the decisive force of historical development. This relentless focus on practical action and the dignity of labor found immediate harmony with the traditional Chinese virtues of pragmatism, 求真务实, diligence, and bravery, 勤劳勇敢. Long before Marx, Chinese philosophers were already engaged in fierce debates over the unity of knowledge and action, 知行合一, questioning whether one should know before acting or act before knowing. Marx provided the ultimate, revolutionary synthesis to this ancient debate. Action is knowledge. Theory is only valid if it survives the brutal friction of material reality. When an idea completely captures the masses, it becomes a material force. This is not a story of a civilization being passively colonized by a European dogma. It is the story of a civilization recognizing its own deepest, suppressed philosophical DNA within the structural critique of an exiled German genius. It was a rhizomatic fusion, a dialectical marriage between the structural critique of industrial modernity and the ethical fabric of an ancient, materially grounded civilization. Dialectical synthesis. The geographical migration of Marxism from the industrial West to the agrarian East exposes the profound difference between the ideological architectures of the two hemispheres. Western capitalism survived Marx's diagnosis by accelerating its own mutations, transforming into the hyper-financialized, digitized, and culturally fragmented hyperreality we inhabit today, successfully atomizing the subject so deeply that a collective revolution seems structurally impossible. The West defeated the specter by transforming the worker into a micro-capitalist, an entrepreneur of the self, perpetually self-exploiting. The East, however, armed with a cultural software that inherently prioritized the collective totality over the atomized individual, was uniquely positioned to operationalize Marx's structural critique. The historical triumph of Marxism in China was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable realization of a worldview that was already, at its core, materially grounded, dialectical, and oriented toward the collective harmony of the human species. But as we stand in the hyper-accelerated present of the 21st century, gazing at a world dominated by AI algorithms, financialized brands, and digital alienation, we must turn the Marxist scalpel back upon itself. In our relentless pursuit of material production, what invisible forces have we ignored? Have we become trapped in a new, even more insidious form of the very mechanical materialism that Marx once fought to destroy? Chapter 9. Philosophical Reflection and Sublimation. The trap of mechanical materialism and the ghost in the machine. We have arrived at the final threshold of our journey. Pull yourself back from the 19th century smog of London and the revolutionary fervor of in the 20s of the 20th century Eurasia. Look around you right now. Look at the glowing rectangle in your hand, the algorithmic feeds predicting your desires, and the artificial intelligence quietly automating the cognitive labor of millions. We are living in a future that even Marx, in his most radical, feverish visions, could barely have anticipated. But here is the ultimate terrifying question we must ask ourselves at the end of this historical autopsy. By obsessively focusing on the material world, have we accidentally trapped ourselves in a completely new kind of prison? Let us return to the grand historical experiment we discussed in the last chapter. The historical materialist framework, when fused with the traditional cultural ethos of diligence and hard work, generated an unprecedented explosion of material production and economic development. We built the factories, we laid the high-gen speed rail, we mastered the global supply chains. We became the ultimate practitioners of material reality, but in our absolute devotion to the tangible, measurable world of physical production, we critically ignored and even systematically downgraded the invisible, non-zen material factors that actually govern human life and societal evolution. We fell into a subtle, dangerous trap. By worshiping the concrete, we became terrified of the abstract. Look at the modern anxiety surrounding technological progress. We are constantly lamenting our struggle with true paradigm-shifting innovation. We excel at taking an existing concept and scaling it from yi to yaolinglin with terrifying efficiency. But when it comes to the radical, disruptive leap from ling to yi, we often hit a massive, invisible wall. Why? Is it because we are not working hard enough? Is it a lack of biological intelligence? Absolutely not. We often mistakenly attribute this failure to individual capability or a lack of motivation. But the deeper, philosophical root of this paralysis lies precisely in the limitations of our deeply ingrained epistemological habits. We have internalized a vulgar mechanical version of materialism. We rely almost entirely on empirical experience and historical data to navigate the future. But true innovation is not a linear optimization of past experiences. It is a violent, structural disruption of experience itself. When you want to create a technology that does not yet exist, you cannot simply look at the material reality in front of you. You must first generate a theoretical hypothesis, a pure conceptual design in the void of the mind. You must build an idea before you can build a product. This requires traversing from the abstract to the concrete, from the realm of consciousness to the realm of matter. It demands robust abstract thinking, fierce logical deduction, and an uncompromising critical mindset. And this absolute reliance on the abstract is exactly what our hyper-Dian pragmatic, materially Dian-obsessed culture has structurally neglected. Let us push this critique even further into the realm of modern global capitalism. Consider the colossal asymmetry in the modern corporate world. For decades, we operated under the naive, mechanical belief that if you simply manufacture a physically superior commodity, success will naturally follow. We championed the old proverb that good wine needs no bush, 酒香不怕巷子深, dismissing brand marketing, corporate culture, strategic vision, and ideological narratives as empty, superficial tricks, mere illusions floating above the real work of the assembly line. But welcome to the hyperreality. In the late stages of capitalism, the signifier has completely detached from the signified. Western corporations did not defeat their global competitors by sweating harder on the factory floor. They defeated them by monopolizing the symbolic order. They seized the highest points of the value chain, the brand, the financial architecture, the intellectual property, and the supply chain networks, extracting massive amounts of surplus value while delegating the physical exhaustion to the developing world. Today, we are brutally waking up to the fact that a company's brand is often its most critical foundational asset. Corporate culture, strategic philosophy, and the narrative you sell to the consumer are not fake deceptions. They are a profound, structural science. They are abstract systems of ideas, much like a theoretical blueprint for a new technology. Yet it is precisely these invisible, abstract constructs that dictate the physical behavior of markets, determine the core competitiveness of an enterprise, and ultimately shape the entire developmental trajectory of a society. This brings us to a terrifying philosophical deadlock, a paradox that shatters the simplistic textbooks of our youth. If the abstract brand dictates the physical factory, if the algorithmic ideology controls human labor, then we must seriously ask, is social existence truly determining social consciousness? Or has social consciousness begun to entirely dictate social existence? Does the economic base still blindly drive the superstructure, or has the superstructure or digital narratives, our legal frameworks, our cultural algorithms, become the supreme dictator of the economic base? In formal logic, we understand that P phi right arrow Q does not inherently guarantee Q right arrow P, but in the dialectics of history, the relationship between matter and mind is a terrifying, endless feedback loop. Many brilliant thinkers in the West have spent their lives grappling with this exact limitation of Marx's historical materialism. Consider the German sociologist and philosopher Max Weber. In his seminal work, The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber launched a devastating counter-Jan argument against the idea that economics alone drives history. He demonstrated how a purely abstract, theological belief system, Calvinist anxiety over salvation, actually generated the psychological drive necessary to build the material engine of modern capitalism. The ghost created the machine. If you want to dive down that particular rabbit hole, you can check out my other deep dive videos on Weber. So where does this leave us, the exhausted, alienated subjects of the Archie-email-T century? We have reached the end of our cinematic autopsy of Karl Marx. We traced his steps from a rebellious youth to the agonizing birth of his materialist philosophy, to his tragic exile, and finally to the monumental, cross-gen cultural migration of his ideas. We have seen his unparalleled genius, and we have brutally dissected his theoretical blind spots. Dialectical synthesis, ultimate lesson of Marxist philosophy, is not to treat his writings as a sacred, unalterable religious text. That is the exact ideological trap he spent his entire life trying to destroy. To truly honor Marx is to apply his ruthless, critical scalpel to his own theories. Every monumental idea possesses a core of emancipatory truth, but it also carries the heavy, inevitable chains of its own historical limitations. If we want to escape the alienation of the modern algorithm, if we want to break through the lean-to-ye barrier and stop being mere biological cogs in a hyper-Jan capitalist machine, we cannot rely on blind empirical labor. We cannot just work harder. We must reclaim the power of the abstract. We must cultivate a fierce, unapologetic critical spirit. We must refuse to blindly accept or blindly reject any dogma. We must keep our minds radically open, listening to the agonizing contradictions of reality and synthesizing the colliding forces of our time. Only by mastering both the material machinery and the spectral symbolic order can we ever hope to truly author our own history. This is the end of our Marxist deep dive, but the abyss of philosophy is bottomless. If this journey shattered a few of your preconceived notions, if it made the screen in front of you look a little more like a prison and a little more like a battlefield, then hit that subscribe button. Join me here in the void. We have many more illusions to deconstruct. Until next time, keep questioning the reality you are forced to consume. I'll see you in the next video.